Good evening and welcome to this, the 2609th meeting of the Caledonian Philatelic Society. We haven't gone far for our guests this evening. Andy has been joining us quite regularly from the Lanarkshire Philatelic Society and was persuaded by me a few months ago to try and put something together from his collection of Fiji. So I think we have three separate short displays. Andy asked me if I wanted one, two, or all three, and the answer was going to be all three, as he expected. So I will leave Andy to unmute himself, share screen, and introduce the first of his displays. Andy, over to you.
I'm getting no sound.
Ditto.
Andy, I don't think any of us can hear you. Have you unmuted?
Oh, it's come back.
Still getting no sound.
Yep, I'm checking.
Oh, hey, you now.
I can hear you now, thank you.
Right, right, good. Glad about that. Right, let me just put that up in the corner. Right, a view from a hotel room when I was in Fiji a couple of years ago. Not bad, is it? I think it's better than the one I've got from my own bedroom window, but there you go. Right, the pre-colonial period of Fiji stamps, as you can see, starts on the 1st of November 1870 and ends on the 10th of October 1874. So it's a very short period, but there's lots of fun involved, if fun is the name of the game. You've got local stamps, which are the Fiji Times Express, and then the post office and the CR stamps, overprints, forgeries of the whole bang shoot, and reprints of the Fiji Times Express stamps. So my backdrop, the Fiji Times and Herald, that's my own photograph of the Times and Herald newspaper offices that exists in Suva. They've moved to new premises. It was actually boarded up when I was there a couple of years ago and had previously been a Chinese restaurant. So it's fulfilled several functions, shall we say. Right, the first printing of the Fiji Times Express, and these are locals. Quite crudely printed, because they're printed in a newspaper printing press rather than a stamp printing press. Paper, a quadrille paper of the time, but these only account for approximately 10% of the total number of stamps produced. And the reason you'll hear me talk approximately's and don't knows, because no records were apparently kept of the number of these stamps which were printed. That was the sheet format, sheets of 24, and as you can see, 4 values, sixpence, shilling, penny, and that is a scan of a plate from one of my reference books, which actually dates back to 1909. Shortly afterwards, there was a second printing, and I've got one or two more of them to show you. Penny, threepence, and a ninepence. And if you look closely at the ninepence stamp, you'll see that there is a comma after express, whereas the other stamps all have a full stop after express. Okay, and going on from there, another one that exists is what they call the shortened N in penny. As you can see there, and that is what the normal should be. And that comes from row 3, position 2, sometimes known as position 14. And that is the sheet makeup. So what they've done with the second printing is they've replaced 3 of the threepenny stamps with 3 ninepence values. Now, of course, all these sheets were printed on gum paper, uncut, unperforated, and finding stamps with decent margins is, of course, a bit of a nightmare. And there you can see position 14 with a shortened N as well. And, oops, sorry, going on, back we go. A pretty horrible forgery. One of many which are known to exist, but could quite easily catch out the unwary because they tend to be offered on a few websites for very little money. Let's put it that way. We'll not mention which websites, of course. Now, this cover, rated at £1, which is a lot of money for 1870 to Australia. But there's a problem with it. It should be dual franked because, of course, the Fiji Times Express were locals. No cancellers, of course, so the hashtag was used to cancel the stamps. Couple of lovely strikes in Australia, shipside in Sydney, and a delivery strike the following day at its destination. So the New South Wales Post Office actually carried that effectively free of charge, or not effectively, but did carry it free of charge, not just a short distance round the corner, but a grand total of about 100 miles. Right? So obviously somebody in the New South Wales Post Office didn't know what they were looking at. Now, before you ask, the cover is not in my possession. There are a lot of zeros after the first figure if you want to buy that. Now we'll come to the imitations. Right? Now there's 3 sets of imitations. One was only discovered in the 1960s. Only one sheet, which followed the same format as the originals, but was destroyed. And there we have what are known as the first reprints. 5 values, penny, threepence, sixpence, ninepence, and £1. And these were printed in sheets of 40. And they were allowed to reprint them to satisfy philatelic demand for the stamps as early as 1876, so 6 years after they were first issued. And the paper, as you can see, is totally different, and the frames are different as well. And this is my own constructed sheet of the first imitations. And I use the word constructed rather than reconstructed because I have no reference whatsoever to be able to use to put the correct stamps in the correct place. Because we go on, this is the only reference I have, again from said first edition. And as you can see, there's only 27 of the 40 varieties there, but not in their correct positions. So there's absolutely nothing with which to work. to give me any ideas as to where any particular stamp should be. Having said that, scan of the sheet, the right-hand half of that sheet is intact, save for this column here, which some kind person has taken out in its entirety. I use the words kind person extremely or very loosely. I could...
Bring that out.
That'll do fine, Ken. Yes, I'll wring their necks would be a very good way to put it. The paper is very fragile. There's a couple of tears there that I've circled, and there's quite a bad tear down the bottom, which has tried to be, or an attempt has been made to repair it in the past, but not very well, as you can see from the misalignment of the type. All these on the left are merely to fill the gaps, if you like. The two in red on the left are vertical pairs, but whether again they're in the right position, your guess is as good as mine. So I say an attempt at putting a whole sheet together, but how correct it is, I'm not even going to attempt to speculate. 10 years later, mid-1880s, another reprint was done. And this time they were done in sheets of 30. Again, the self-same 5 values. Oops, sorry. Right. And again, scan and you'll see them in the full sheets in a second, where the typesetter has dropped the S's in Express on a couple of the stamps. Now, whether the sheets with the dropped S were printed first, the problem noted, corrected, and then the printing resumed, or whether the plate broke and these are at the end of the print run, again, I have no idea. We've got the self-same 5 values, shilling, 9pence, 6pence, and 3pence and a penny. But we've also got a different typeface on one of the 3pence and one of the penny stamps. And there are the full sheets with the dropped S's. And as you can see, the different type for the 3pence there and a different type for the penny there. Obviously, the typesetter didn't have enough of the same font to do the same all the way across each of the values. These printed on quite a thick reddish paper. It's quite rough, and these were actually rouletted. And there's the other version where you see the S has been repaired or is in its correct place. Right, now we come on to 1871 and the formation of the first formal government in Fiji. Prior to 1871, the governance of the islands was a bit like the Middle Ages in this country. If your tribal warriors were able to knock lumps out of next door's tribal warriors, then you ruled that patch of land. And it wasn't until the sort of mid-1850s when one of the clan chiefs, who was a wee bit more enlightened, a chief called Seru Sakambau, he made overtures to both the Americans and the British to come in and take over government, if you like. Now, of course, in around the 1860s, the Americans had other things on their mind, like the Civil War. So the British came in and helped to form a government under Thackenbau's leadership. Now, what was formed as a government was what was called the Great Council of Chiefs, the GCC, with Thackenbau as its leader. right? And they passed the Postal Act, and these 3 stamps, penny, threepence and sixpence, were ordered from Sydney. And as you can see, they're based on a New South Wales tenpence stamp of 1867, which was also printed in Sydney. Right, and the CR monogram stands for Thackenbow Rex, because he was elected the Great Chief or the leader. And the reason I pronounce Thackenbow as I do, but the letter C appears, is because in Fijian, a C is pronounced as we would pronounce TH. There are many other vagaries of the Fijian language as well, which may come up. We'll see. Right, so these were issued 3rd of December 1871. And that is a sheet format. Sheets of 50, like so, with the watermark Fiji postage across only the middle row, like so. So rows 1 and 2 and rows 4 and 5 were essentially without overprint whatsoever. Without watermark whatsoever. So the forgers had great delight in that. And here we have said forgeries, of which there are many. They're relatively easy to spot. Concentric circle canceller is the best one to look for. The other things to look for are the surrounds on the central vignette are all the same on each of the stamps. And another giveaway is that on the genuine stamps, the base of the crown is flat, whereas on the forgery, the base of the crown has a semicircular shadow. But these all appeared on the scene at some point in time after those. Right? And there's a couple of really, this one particularly is another very poor forgery. Really poor canceller. It's not even the correct colour. The threepenny value should be green, not brown. Okay, and another one quite crisp, but definitely a forgery as well. The surround on the central vignette is wrong, as is the base of the crown, as is the canceller. Now we have the cents overprints. And here we have the reason for the cents overprints is because from 1867 until 1874, Fiji was actually using decimal currency. And of course, that begs the question, why the Fiji Times priced their stamps in pennies? And of course, why did the post office initially value their stamps in pence? Good question. Nobody knows the answer. So these stamps were reprinted in Sydney and overprinted 2 cents, 6 cents, and 12 cents. Right? There's a question, and the Reserve Bank in Fiji tells you. So the initial stamps were only on sale for around 6 weeks. Okay, and these are the estimated numbers printed. And just for good measure, a local overprint for duty. Probably stamp duty, whatever, and of course a fiscal cancellation. Very scarce to lay your hands on. Printed numbers, again, unknown. And of course, we have the forgeries of these overprints. Again, the concentric circle cancels, the same surround for the central vignette and the same shadow on the crown, on the base of the crown. There are quite a number of different forgers. Some have been identified, the Spiral brothers being one, Francois Fournier being another, but there are many whose source is completely, totally unknown. Right? They usually come in singles, but I was fortunate enough to be able to lay my hands on that. And that gives you a clear picture of the cancels, the forgery and the forged value overprint, the forged stamps. As I say, very seldom do you find them in blocks. They usually just come in singles. Oops, not what I meant to do. A different forger, possibly Fournier. You can see the font is different. It's very poor. And again, the self-same canceller and the self-same folks on it. And these are the only two cancellers which were used prior to colonial times. Very crude, produced locally, very rare. I don't have any examples of stamps with that the GPO cancel on it at all. It was only in use for a very, very short time. Second one, probably produced in Australia. And it shows GPO Levuka, which at that time was the capital of Fiji. Levuka remained the capital until 1882 when the British moved it to Suva, simply because Levuka rather is a very small town on a relatively small island with a relatively small harbour and no land to build all the buildings that they wanted to build it on. And that takes us to the 10th of October 1874. And these next three photographs are the actual deed of cession. So in other words, what happened on the 10th of October was the Great Council of Chiefs effectively handed governance, I should say, of Fiji over to the British with this document. It only runs to 3 pages. And these photographs are my own, which I took in the Fiji Museum when I was in Suva a couple of years ago. And you can see there that although it's written in English and the British representatives have signed it, all the chiefs in the Great Council have used fingerprints or thumbprints or whatever to attest their acknowledgement of the document. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the first part of tonight's proceedings. So if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer.
Anyone got any questions?
Just a comment, if I may. Mr. Griffiths, the proprietor of the Fiji Times, set up a similar newspaper up in Samoa in 1877, but it didn't last more than 5 years because the population, the European population in Samoa was only 100 or so, whereas the Fijian population was much greater. So his newspaper collapsed. But he called his first stamps the Samoa Express.
Oh.
Sorry, thank you.
Interesting that the Fiji Times in itself still exists to this day. It's the principal, well, it's one of 2 English language daily newspapers now. When it started life, it was actually a weekly paper, right? But it's renowned in Fiji for having a very anti-government stance. Let's put it that way. It's very critical of the current government. And as such, doesn't tend to get too many government-sponsored adverts. Right.
Anyone else? Well, in that case, Andy, would you like to proceed with part 2?
I will indeed. Right, Zoom meeting. Share screen and share. Right, this display relates to a set of stamps, as you can see, issued earlier on this year. It's principally photographs, but it's the launch party of these stamps which were produced for the post office. Back end of last year, the chief executive issued an edict to say that the post office is skint, principally thanks to COVID. So any stamp issues had to be sponsored, as it were. The post office had been working with this charity, which is a Hindu charity. And as you can see, it's actually 125, been running in India for 125 years, but only for 20 years in Fiji. Right, so they came along and said, yes, we'll sponsor an issue, blah, 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 blah. And as is normal, we got 4 stamps produced. 38 cents is the local inland rate, which means that your letter will get there eventually. $1.38 is what they call fast post, which means it will get there but a wee bit quicker. The $2 and the $5 were principal high values, more likely to be used for parcels and things like that. Although, if you add the $2 and the 38 cent together, you get the inland registered rate as well. So 4 stamps issued on the 27th of February this year. And there's the first day cover. All locally designed, something I'll come back to in a minute or two. A launch party was held for it, and among the attendees were Dr. Bansod, who is the chief executive of the post office. The young lady in purple, her name is Alavina, and the lady in yellow, her name is Anjani, and they're the 2 ladies that I deal with on a very regular basis in the Philatelic Bureau. And in the middle of them is the Prime Minister of Fiji, who was the guest of honour, if you like. You'll get, again, a better photograph of him just in a minute. When he was there, he signed 6 first day covers. Only 6, although I knew in advance that he was going to be there, and I suggested he might sign a few more and then sell them off to raise funds for the charity. Unfortunately, he only did 6. And there's one of them. And you get no prizes for guessing in whose possession that one happens to be. That is the only signed cover which, to my knowledge, is in collector hands. Presentation party, if you like. Gentleman on the left, his name is Dr. Redwan Al-Karim Bayan, who is a local medical doctor, but he is a local philatelist, and he also consults with the post office on stamp issues. Next to him is Isaac Moe, who is the retail manager for the post office. Better photographs of him coming shortly as well. Alavina, Dr. Bansod. The lady in yellow her name is Nirmala. I don't know her second name. She is the chair of the local branch of the charity. And of course, Anjani. Anjani, this is the stamp designer. Now, he did all the work. He's a local Fijian man. He's a member of the Suva branch of the charity. His name is Mr. Sumanta Rout, R-O-U-T. And he did all the artwork for all the stamps and for the first day cover. Again, Anjani, she manages to get herself in a lot of these photographs. Next to her is Elizabeth Tanya Sidal, who is the post office marketing guru. Nirmala and her husband, again, whose name I don't know. Clearer picture of the presentation party. Right, all done for the two ladies of the Bureau, all geared up, ready to do all the standing orders. And Alevina talking to the Prime Minister. Elizabeth, and again, they're really the sort of brains behind the operation, if you like. Isaac looks and is what you might call a very solid citizen. He is actually a former Fijian international rugby player. He was a winger, believe it or not. And he even makes me look small, as you will see later. This photograph, I've entitled Two Mothers, Two Daughters. The young lady on the left is Alevina's daughter, Ali. She was roped in to attend and help at the launch party. She's actually just qualified as a primary school teacher and teaches in one of the schools in Suva. And the young lady in white is Anjani's daughter, whose name is Needy, and she's in her final year at high school and hopes to go on to be a doctor. Mother and daughter again, and Anjani and her sister Sangita. Now, Sangita doesn't work in the post office, but she does have a bit of a tenuous link to the post office. She runs a computer supplies shop, which in actual fact used to be the street front shop or the shop front of the Philatelic Bureau back in its more halcyon days. And that is Sangita's daughter, whose name is Yanvi. Two daughters side by side. Would you let your daughter have a chat with the Prime Minister? Well, in Fiji you do, but I'm not so sure you'd do it in this country. And nothing to do with the launch party at all. The two ladies of the Philatelic Bureau, some Scotsman or other with a Fiji rugby shirt. And as you can see, Isaac even makes me look small. Those of you know me, I'm not exactly don't exactly have a self-light figure. So there you go, folks. That concludes round 2. And again, if anybody wants any ask any questions, please do.
Not a question, but I love the dresses, particularly Anjita's daughter. Gorgeous white dress.
And it's just lovely to see some local colour. And I don't necessarily mean about the clothes, but just to put some context into it. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Agreed.
all these photographs were sent to me either by Isaac or Alevina or Anjani. They're all taken on the phones. And I say even before I was in Suva a couple of years ago, but especially since, I've built up a very good both personal and working relationship with them. So they knew I made a comment about putting something together, and they said, "Aye, okay, here you go." And I got a wad of photographs sent to me. And
delightful.
And that's how that was put together. So it was just I originally did it because as I said to Alistair earlier on in the week, PowerPoint is something which is foreign to me, and that was the sort of first one I put together to try and get to grips with it. And it actually that PowerPoint, with the exception of the final photograph, has actually been well circulated around the post office in Suva.
Do let them know how much we enjoyed it.
Yep. Well, I'll be talking to either Alavina or Anjani in the next few days. They've got a bit of a COVID problem at the present moment. They've got localized lockdown areas and things like that. And I know Anjani's been stuck in the house for the last week, and I know she's bored to tears. Right.
Okay.
Right. And now the one you've really all been waiting for. Sorry, girls, this is sort of one for the boys, if you like. Right? Fiji's trains. Now, I'll lay you odds that there are a number of folk who didn't even think that Fiji, a small Pacific island country, would have quite an extensive railway system. But it's not a passenger railway system. I started putting this all together when I acquired this photograph, which is the actual posed photograph.
Andy, if I can interrupt, we're not seeing anything on the screen.
Oh, you're not? Right.
No.
Sorry. Let me end it. I know what I didn't do, Alistair. Sorry, my fault. No, I want that. And share. Right, so we'll go back to square one and start again then.
Yep.
Sorry about that, folks. I forgot to share screen again when I was changing files. Right, Fiji's trains. Right, I'll come back to that poster a little later. I started putting this together, as I said, when I acquired this particular photograph here. That was posed for a 1956 definitive. It was taken by the official government photographer, who was a New Zealander called Robert Wright, or Rob Wright. Now, he was a government photographer from 1941 until he retired in 1969. And as you can see, that's the fruits of his labours as issued in the 1956 definitive series. Now, despite the fact that there is an extensive railway system, the sugar cane trains, as they're affectionately known, have only appeared twice since on stamps. First in 76 and then again in 1999. Right, and that's a map of Fiji, and the dark green areas are the sugar cane growing areas on the two principal islands. And the reason for the railways is, which started being developed in Edwardian, the early 1900s into early George V years, is because the road system in Fiji, as it still is basic. Let's put it that way. To give you an idea, at the bottom of your picture where my mouse is, that is Suva. And the main airport is at Nandi, which is very close to Lautoka. To get from one to t'other by road, you literally follow the coastline all the way around, and it takes 4 hours to do roughly 120 miles. So it's not exactly a quick journey. It's a comfortable journey in a modern air-conditioned coach, I'll grant you, but the road system is as was. Right, first day cover with the sugar train cancellation on for the 1976 issue. And the sugarcane trains have come up in lots and lots of guises. Cigarette type card for the Kellogg Company of Great Britain. Maximum card for the 1976 issue as well. You'll notice that the exhaust from the locomotive is rather dark. And that's because The steam locomotives, as were used, didn't burn coal. What they did was they used the residue from the cane processing, compacted it into bales, and they used that to fuel the fire. Right? Because there's no coal in Fiji at all. Anything of that nature has to be imported. So they decided to use what they had an abundance of, and that was the waste from the crushing process. Another card that I came across, this time I suspect it was in a bar of rock from Blackpool. Bit basic, but it's still there nonetheless. Cane fields, that's a postcard I have. I suspect it dates from the 1950s, maybe the 1960s, something around there anyway. A black and white one from much earlier, a bit grainy. And the sugarcane train itself, and you can see the length of it. It goes all the way back. Now, another interesting thing is you see the siding there into the cane field. The track there is actually lifted out with the cutting season and stacked in a pile in the corner. So when they want to come in and cut the cane in that particular field, they lay out the track, roll in the wagons, load them up, pull the wagons out and lift the track up and then cultivate the cane again. All right, bit clearer photograph. Again, bit of exhaust. Again, another postcard I have probably dates from the 1950s. Many of these steam locomotives were actually built in the UK at the Hunslet Company in Leeds, or just outside Leeds. And a modern one, a level crossing, Fijian style. And you can see the empty cane carriers there. The gauge is 2 feet. And again, going across the new Singatoka Bridge. The old one was washed away following a hurricane or a cyclone, as they call it, early 1990s, if I remember correctly, and they had to build that one because not only the old one also carried the main road as well as the railway. They've now built 2 bridges, one for the road and one for the railway. Another fully loaded cane train on its way, and you can see the length of it, and a modern, of course, diesel, again, built in the Hunslet. You have train crashes there as well. Now, don't ask whether the bus hit the locomotive or the locomotive hit the bus, but they came into contact. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the bus itself. Local service buses in Fiji don't have side windows. These are completely empty all the way along there. Right, wonderful air conditioning. I've used them on many occasions. Wonderful air conditioning, but they are a bit humid and claustrophobic when it rains, because what they do is these are canvas rollers, and what they do is they just roll them down. They end up more or less along the base of the white line would be on the bus there. And the water sheds off the roof, down the canvas, down the outside, and away it goes. Right. Another shot of sugarcane on its way, cutting season. Now, the passenger service. Prior to 1974, nationalisation, the CSR, the Colonial Sugar Refining Company, ran passenger trains out with the cutting season. It kept the drivers, the firemen, etc., in a job. And then when the cane cutting season came along, they were employed doing it. So the free train, the only free train service anywhere in the world. It was, and you can see that, you know, sitting behind the locomotive and the amount of exhaust couldn't have been an overly pleasant experience if the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. And then a more modern one with a diesel locomotive. But in 1974, the CSR was nationalised and became the Fiji Sugar Corporation. And government, being government, said, you're not getting your free train service anymore, and passenger train services as good as don't exist. Another very grainy one, and again you can see the amount of exhaust coming from the locomotives or the locomotive. Now, back to the brochure. Coral Coast Railway. The Coral Coast is on the west coast of the main island, Viti Levu. It's the main holiday area because it's very handy for Nandi International Airport, which means that the transfer from Nandi to your hotel on the Coral Coast is relatively short. It's also much drier, much sunnier, and a bit hotter than being in Suva. But Suva tends to give an impression of heat because it tends to be very humid at times. Coral Coast Railway, privately run, they're allowed to use the tracks or hire the use of the tracks out with the cutting season. And there's a more modern version thereof. The inside of the brochure, don't miss the tourist train. Now, strangely enough, I've never actually been on it. So I don't know how long the train ride lasts, because anytime I've been there, it's been I've not been anywhere near it, either a hotel on the Coral Coast, or for that matter, I've been in Suva, which is, what, 100 miles away from it. Now, while I was doing some research, I discovered that some of the Fiji steam trains had been repatriated to the UK, and they run on a privately owned 2-foot narrow gauge railway called the Statfold Barn Railway, which is down in the Midlands in England. Fully restored and running, and the last few photographs are all photographs of their locomotives which have been repatriated. The beautiful SBR, Statfold Barn Railway, CSR, Colonial Sugar Refining Company. So they've kept the original livery on it as well. Larger tender locomotive, now converted to run on coal, of course, because of course we don't have sugarcane waste to burn. This locomotive has actually been named Fiji. Right, and there's a better picture of it on the turntable. Right, doing its work. And another one. And this is one of the steam locomotives. It's actually sits at the front gate of, as you can see, the Raffles Gateway. The Raffles Gateway is literally right across the road from the main entrance to Nandi Airport. It was one of the hotels I stayed in when I was there. This photograph is a photograph taken by a good friend of mine in the study circle, John Ray, and that was taken in 2013 when John was there. And that's my photograph of the same locomotive taken in 2019. So it's had a paint job. And finally, just two photographs which are merged together to let you see the then and now. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the trilogy of a small part of my collection of Fiji.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was really interesting. Any questions for Andy?
Yep. Don't be afraid. Doesn't need to be related to what I've shown you tonight. If you want to know anything about the country or whatever, feel free to ask.
Andy, my name's Frank, and
Yes.
I'm a guest tonight. So,
Yep.
very interested in your railway section, and I'm definitely going to be after that 1976 maximum card that you showed in the display. But I was also very interested in the Coral Coast Railway that you mentioned.
Yep.
And found your photographs fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Yep. Well,
So
again,
thank you.
yeah, you're welcome, Frank. Again, most of these photographs I have acquired from various websites, things like that. The stamps, the postcards, they're certainly all mine. But when I get stuck into a subject, I try to sort of round it out a bit, if you like. And the internet is a wonderful resource for me to get photographs, background, and things like that as well. But it keeps me amused. Let's put it that way.
That's most interesting. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, me again. Another guest. Did you meet the toads?
Sorry?
Did you meet the toads? My memory of landing at Nandi was leaving the patio light on overnight and being wakened at 3 o'clock in the morning by a congregation of toads sitting underneath the light, catching the moths that were dropping down. Toad.
No, but what I will say is that some of the shall we call them flying objects are not exactly small. Let's put it that way.
Now they introduced the cane toad to the sugar cane to cut down the mosquitoes, and there was no natural predator for the cane toad, so Fiji was infested with toads.
Yeah. Well, last time I was in Fiji, as I say, a couple of years ago, I was only in Nandi for 4 or 5 days, and I was in the raffles, and you can actually smell the jet exhaust. So I have a feeling that might have had something to do with the fact that the wildlife where I was in the gateway was rather sparse. Let's put it that way. But it's also true to say, when was it you were actually in Fiji?
No. We're talking 50 years back.
You would not recognise Nandi Airport Terminal then?
No. I taught in Samoa, and one of the things they were dead scared about was actually getting an invasion of Fijian toads. And we had to dissect frogs for the New Zealand school certificate. And one of the kids stole the frog and took it down the road. Decided it was a bit wet in her pocket, so she chucked it in the middle of the roadway, and the first vehicle to come along was the Director of Agriculture.
Oh dear.
Wobbly.
Patience.
When he found this Fijian toad in the middle of the road. There was a plague of toads in Fiji because of the sugarcane, and no natural predator.
Yeah. Sugarcane is one of the top 3 revenue-raising industries, if you like, in Fiji. Tourism and gold being the other 2. And of course, the tourism trade has been non-existent for the last year.
Yes, I was going to ask you, Andy, if there are any more plans for sponsored stamp issues. It's an intriguing concept, which I hope doesn't spread.
At the moment, no, because there's a couple of anniversaries coming up. Later on this year, Fiji Airways celebrates its 70th birthday, and they were going to do an issue for them, but they would have to be sponsored. And Fiji Airways turned around and said, no. Because they're skint as well. Because basically they've been grounded to a greater or lesser extent for the last year. Many of the shops in Suva particularly are feeling the pinch as well, because there are 52 weeks a year, an average of 2, maybe 3 cruise ships come into port, disgorge several thousand people into the shops, and it literally takes 10 minutes from the wharf into the shops to walk, never mind by bus. So they come in, they spend their money, they hope, but of course they've had none of that for the last year as well. So the shops, the likes of Jack's, Patel's, Tapu City, Hedstrom's, to name 4 of them off the top of my head, and there will be others as well. They're cutting back their workers' hours and things like that as well, because they've not had the tourist business.
Same all over. Yeah.
Yep.
Terrible.
Yep. There's actually talk of the post office cutting back hours and or salaries as well, especially back office staff.
And as you say, they've got problems at the moment with lockdown and things because of the
Yes,
current problem with it.
that's right, Lynn. Yeah, I know Anjani in the bureau. She's been what they've it's very localized, what they call a containment area, but a lockdown area the same, and it's rigidly enforced. She's been literally unable to get beyond the end of her street for the last week. Right, although she did tell me this actually this morning that she'll be allowed to go out as of 5 a.m. the day after tomorrow, Saturday. Right, the containment area will be lifted, but the way they're doing it over there is they're sort of, once they get their track and trace or their equivalent of, they basically just go boom, you'll put the clamps on. Nobody in, nobody out.
Do they have vaccination at the moment? Or?
Yes, they've got a vaccination program going. How it's working, I don't know, and I don't know the ins and outs of it. But it's more a case of, if you want a vaccination, or at least I get the impression that if you want a vaccination, then you can go online or use your phone app and you'll book one. One of the things that they do have over there, as far as COVID is concerned, is that if you have a mobile phone, the mobile phone operators automatically downloaded a test and trace app, which is always on. So, right, unlike over here where you've got the option of whether you can download it or not.
Yeah, very different.
Right, so they've got different rules, different ways of doing it. But it's actually amazing.
Coping best they can.
Well, the truth of the matter is, Lynn, as far as COVID's concerned, they followed, if you like, the New Zealand formula.
Don't let people in.
Basically, right at the outset, they close the borders. You don't get in, you don't get out, unless you're an essential business traveller and you did 14 days quarantine when you landed. And it worked pretty well. But over the last 3-4 weeks, it was actually a member of the military, the Fiji military, the RFMF, who'd been on peacekeeping duties, I don't know where, under the UN flag, was tested before he got on the plane, was tested when he got off the plane, and 2 days later tested positive, by which time
he'd spread it, slowly spread.
It had spread, because in the intervening time, he'd been to a funeral amongst right, and the the number of cases, new cases each day is very, very small. You're talking about the fingers of both hands, but you're talking about a country which has a population of only about 900,000. So you've got to look at it all in context.
Yeah, and they don't want it to spread.
And they don't want it to spread. And of course, the other side of the coin is they don't have the benefit system, the support systems that we have in this country.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed for them.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, they haven't had any national lockdowns, things like that, but up until about 3-4 weeks ago, they could walk about anywhere they liked, party, go to bars, you name it, unlike us. Didn't need to wear masks at all. Now masks are mandatory everywhere. You know, so they've actually gone the sort of polar opposite of us over the last 4 or 5 weeks.
That's the problem as you relax things. But
It's one of the
anyway,
points
enough.
to make
Yeah.
Stamp launched the fact that everybody was together, no masks, and not distancing, but clearly
Yeah.
that has had to change.
Well, I know, for instance, Alvin and Anjani share an office with 1 or 2 other people, which is, I wouldn't have, having been in it, take my word for it, it's not that big. And even in their office, they've got to wear masks now. But that wasn't the case up until about 3 weeks ago.
Any other questions? I'm not trying to change the topic, but
No.
any other questions for Andy?
See, any questions at all?
In that case, Andy, can I thank you very much for giving us the 3 displays tonight. They were all very different in their own way, but equally interesting and with some fascinating material. And I thank you most sincerely for putting all of that together for us.
Yeah, you're more than welcome, Alistair.
Thank you indeed. Our next meeting is in 2 weeks' time, when another of our regular guests, Harry Jackson, has agreed to give a display on the Monte Rosa, a ship which was later renamed the Empire Windrush, and the history books under that name. And Harry has a display, and he's got some technical challenges for me to solve as well for you. But look forward to that. And before we go, can I just mention, I've told a number of people, but in case anyone hasn't heard, I'm sorry to have to tell you that Julia MacLeod passed away on Monday afternoon. So that will be a sad loss to both the Lanarkshire Society and to the Caledonian and to many others. But that's I don't have any other details at the moment at all, but if anyone's interested, get in touch and we'll pass on what we know in due course.
Lovely lady.
Thank you all for attending, and it's good night from me, as they used to say, and good night from him. Good night.
Good night, all.
Bye. Thank you.